In the gleaming towers of Houston's Lakewood Church, 16,000 worshipers gather every Sunday to hear a message that would have horrified Jesus Christ himself. Pastor Joel Osteen, flashing his trademark smile from beneath perfectly coiffed hair, stands before a congregation seated in what was once a basketball arena and delivers sermons about living your best life now and becoming a better you. Behind him, massive video screens display his image to overflow crowds, while bookstores in the lobby sell his best-selling guides to spiritual and financial success. Welcome to the American Prosperity Gospel, where following Jesus has become indistinguishable from following the stock market. But here's what will shock you. This wasn't an accident. The marriage between American Christianity and capitalism wasn't the result of theological evolution or divine revelation. It was the product of a deliberate, centuries-long campaign to transform a religion built on the radical message that the meek shall inherit the earth into an ideology that celebrates the rich as God's chosen people. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we uncover the hidden forces that reshaped our world. What you're about to discover is one of the most successful ideological transformations in human history. How American religious leaders gradually abandoned Christianity's traditional suspicion of wealth and power to become capitalism's most enthusiastic cheerleaders. This isn't just a story about religion or economics. It's about how an entire civilization redefined the meaning of salvation itself. Before we dive into this extraordinary tale of faith, money, and power, hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell, because what we're about to reveal will change how you understand both American religion and American capitalism forever. And I'm genuinely curious about our global community. Drop a comment telling me what time you're watching this and which city you're tuning in from. This story of how spirituality became commodity resonates across cultures and economic systems worldwide. The story begins not with acceptance, but with fierce resistance. The earliest Christians viewed wealth with deep suspicion, following Jesus' explicit warnings about the spiritual dangers of material riches. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God, Christ declared, setting up a fundamental tension between spiritual and material values that would define Christianity for its first 15 centuries. This anti-wealth tradition continued well into American colonial history. The Puritans who founded New England certainly believed in hard work and economic productivity, but they viewed wealth accumulation with profound ambivalence. They saw prosperity as a potential sign of God's blessing, but they were equally convinced that riches posed spiritual dangers that required constant vigilance. Consider the writings of Cotton Mather, one of colonial America's most influential Puritan ministers. In 1701, he warned his congregation, "A man may lawfully possess riches, but he must not be possessed by them." Mather advocated what he called a Christian at his calling, working diligently in one's profession while remaining detached from material rewards. The goal wasn't wealth maximization, but spiritual discipline. This traditional Christian suspicion of wealth began to crack under the pressure of American economic development in the 18th and 19th centuries. As the new nation experienced unprecedented economic growth, religious leaders faced a troubling question. If America was a Christian nation blessed by God, how could its increasing prosperity be anything but divine approval? The answer came from an unlikely source. A German sociologist named Max Weber, who would identify what he called the Protestant work ethic. Weber argued that Calvinist theology, with its emphasis on predestination and worldly success as evidence of divine election, had inadvertently created the cultural foundation for modern capitalism. But Weber was describing what had already happened, not prescribing what should happen. American religious leaders would take his analysis and turn it into theology. The transformation accelerated dramatically during the Industrial Revolution, when American capitalism created wealth on a scale that dwarfed anything in human history. Faced with the obvious contradiction between Christian teachings about humility and poverty and the spectacular riches being generated by American enterprise, religious leaders had three choices: condemn the new economy, ignore it, or sanctify it. Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate who became one of the richest men in human history, provided the blueprint for sanctification with his famous essay, The Gospel of Wealth, published in 1889. Carnegie argued that extreme inequality was not only natural but divinely ordained, because it allowed men of superior ability to accumulate resources that could then be used for the benefit of mankind. The man who dies rich dies disgraced, Carnegie declared, but his solution wasn't to prevent wealth accumulation. It was to encourage wealthy men to give away their fortunes before death. This gospel of wealth allowed rich Christians to have their cake and eat it too. They could accumulate unlimited riches during their lifetimes, while still claiming to follow Jesus' teachings about the spiritual dangers of wealth. But Carnegie's approach required extraordinary personal discipline and genuine commitment to philanthropy. What American Christianity needed was a theological system that made wealth accumulation itself a form of spiritual practice. That system emerged in the early 20th century through the convergence of several powerful intellectual and cultural currents. The first was the New Thought movement, which taught that mental attitudes could directly influence material circumstances. New Thought pioneers like Phineas Quimby and Mary Baker Eddy argued that proper thinking could literally create prosperity, health, and happiness. This was revolutionary theology that made material success a direct result of spiritual practice. The second was the rise of corporate America and the professional managerial class, which created millions of middle-class Americans who needed to reconcile their Christian faith with their participation in competitive capitalism. These were people who weren't robber barons like Carnegie, but ordinary business people who wanted to believe their work served God's purposes. The man who synthesized these currents into a coherent theology was Norman Vincent Peale, whose 1952 bestseller, The Power of Positive Thinking, became one of the most influential religious books in American history. Peale's genius was packaging New Thought principles in traditional Christian language, creating a form of faith that promised both spiritual salvation and material success. Believe in yourself, have faith in your abilities, Peale declared. Without a humble but reasonable confidence in your own powers, you cannot be successful or happy. This wasn't traditional Christianity, which taught that happiness came from surrendering personal will to divine will. This was therapeutic Christianity that made personal success a religious obligation. Peale's influence extended far beyond his books and sermons. He personally mentored a young real estate developer named Donald Trump, whose father brought the family to Peale's Marble Collegiate Church in Manhattan. Trump would later credit Peale with teaching him the power of positive thinking and self-confidence that fueled his business career. The connection between Peale's prosperity theology and Trump's eventual political success illustrates the far-reaching consequences of Christianity's embrace of capitalism. But Peale was just the beginning. The real breakthrough came with the rise of televangelism in the 1960s and 1970s, which transformed religious broadcasting from traditional preaching into sophisticated marketing operations that sold spiritual products to mass audiences. Oral Roberts pioneered the techniques that would define prosperity preaching for generations. Roberts didn't just ask for donations, he promised miraculous returns on spiritual investments. Send money to his ministry, Roberts claimed, and God would multiply the gift back to the giver many times over. This seed faith theology transformed charitable giving into a form of spiritual speculation that promised guaranteed returns. Roberts's approach was revolutionary because it eliminated the traditional Christian emphasis on selfless giving. Instead of donating money to help the poor or support religious institutions, Roberts's supporters were investing in their own future prosperity. Charity became capitalism, and capitalism became spirituality. The theological implications were staggering. Traditional Christianity taught that material blessings were secondary to spiritual salvation, and that worldly success might actually impede spiritual development. Roberts flipped this completely, arguing that material prosperity was both evidence of spiritual favor and a tool for expanding God's kingdom. This prosperity theology exploded across American Christianity in the 1970s and 1980s, spreading far beyond Pentecostal and charismatic churches to influence mainstream Protestant denominations. The message was seductive because it resolved the fundamental tension between Christian faith and capitalist practice that had troubled believers for centuries. Pat Robertson took prosperity theology even further by explicitly linking it to conservative politics and free market economics. Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network became a powerful platform for promoting both religious and political messages, arguing that supporting capitalism wasn't just economically sound, but spiritually essential. Robertson's 700 Club television program seamlessly blended faith healing, prosperity preaching, and political commentary into a coherent worldview that made opposition to free market capitalism tantamount to opposition to God himself. When Robertson ran for president in 1988, he carried this message into mainstream American politics, helping to create the religious right's unwavering support for pro-business policies. The theological framework that Robertson and other prosperity preachers developed had profound implications for how American Christians understood poverty and inequality. If wealth was evidence of God's blessing and spiritual maturity, then poverty must be evidence of spiritual failure or divine disfavor. This theology provided religious justification for reducing social welfare programs and opposing government efforts to address economic inequality. The prosperity gospel reached its current form through the ministry of Kenneth Copeland, who has become one of the most successful religious entrepreneurs in American history. Copeland's approach combines traditional prosperity theology with sophisticated business practices that have made him enormously wealthy, while providing a model for other religious entrepreneurs. Copeland's ministry operates multiple businesses, including television production, publishing, real estate development, and aviation services. His personal fleet of private jets, valued at over $20 million, is justified as necessary tools for spreading the gospel efficiently. Critics who question such lavish spending are dismissed as spiritually immature people who don't understand God's desire to bless his faithful servants. But perhaps the most successful practitioner of prosperity theology is Joel Osteen, whose Lakewood Church in Houston represents the complete triumph of market principles over traditional Christian values. Osteen's church operates more like an entertainment corporation than a traditional religious institution, with professional marketing, corporate partnerships, and revenue streams that would impress any business school graduate. Osteen's sermons avoid traditional Christian themes like sin, judgment, and sacrifice in favor of motivational messages about personal empowerment and positive thinking. His books outsell most secular self-help authors, and his television program reaches millions of viewers worldwide. He has successfully transformed Christianity into a lifestyle brand that appeals to middle-class consumers seeking spiritual validation for their material ambitions. The success of prosperity theology reflects deeper changes in American religious culture that extend far beyond individual preachers or ministries. The same market forces that transformed American retail, entertainment, and media also transformed American religion, creating churches that compete for members like businesses compete for customers. Megachurches like Osteen's Lakewood represent the complete capitalization of American Christianity. These institutions offer multiple services, diverse programming, and consumer amenities that would be familiar to any shopping mall developer. They feature coffee shops, bookstores, childcare centers, fitness facilities, and entertainment venues designed to attract and retain members in an increasingly competitive religious marketplace. The business model is sophisticated and effective. Megachurches use market research to identify consumer preferences, focus groups to test messaging strategies, and professional marketing to build brand awareness. They offer products and services that meet felt needs while generating revenue streams that support continued expansion. This market-driven approach has transformed the content of American Christianity, as well as its organizational structure. Churches that succeed in the religious marketplace are those that offer messages that consumers want to hear, not necessarily messages that challenge consumers to spiritual growth or social transformation. The result is a form of Christianity that validates rather than challenges American consumer culture. Instead of calling people to reject materialism in favor of spiritual values, prosperity theology encourages people to pursue material success as a form of spiritual practice. Instead of demanding sacrificial love for others, it promises personal fulfillment and individual prosperity. The political implications of Christianity's embrace of capitalism became fully visible during the rise of the religious right in the 1970s and 1980s. Leaders like Jerry Falwell and James Dobson explicitly linked evangelical Christianity to free market economics, arguing that capitalism was not just compatible with Christian faith, but essential to it. This political theology reached its culmination during the Reagan presidency, when evangelical leaders provided religious justification for policies that dramatically reduced government regulation of business, cut taxes on the wealthy, and eliminated social programs for the poor. Reagan's economic policies weren't just presented as practical necessity, but as moral imperatives that aligned with biblical principles. The 2016 election of Donald Trump revealed how completely American evangelicalism had prioritized economic ideology over traditional Christian values. Despite Trump's obvious moral failings and his complete unfamiliarity with Christian teachings, he received overwhelming support from evangelical voters who were convinced that his pro-business policies served God's purposes. The theological contortions required to support Trump illustrated how far American Christianity had traveled from its historical roots. Evangelical leaders who had spent decades emphasizing the importance of personal morality and biblical values suddenly discovered that political and economic considerations were more important than spiritual ones. This transformation reflects the complete success of a centuries-long campaign to remake American Christianity in capitalism's image. What began as theological speculation about the relationship between faith and prosperity had become religious orthodoxy that made support for free market capitalism a test of spiritual authenticity. Contemporary prosperity theology extends far beyond obviously commercial ministries like Austeen's or Copeland's. It has influenced mainstream Protestant denominations, Catholic teachings about social justice, and even progressive Christian movements that emphasize economic empowerment over traditional concerns about spiritual salvation. The language of American Christianity has been thoroughly commercialized, with churches marketing products, pastors functioning as CEOs, and congregations conceived as customers whose needs must be met through efficient service delivery. This business vocabulary isn't just metaphorical. It reflects fundamental changes in how religious institutions understand their purpose and measure their success. The global expansion of American-style prosperity theology through television, internet, and missionary activities has exported this commercialized Christianity around the world, often with devastating consequences for traditional religious communities that emphasize spiritual discipline over material prosperity. In Nigeria, Ghana, and other African countries, American prosperity preachers have built massive followings by promising that proper faith can overcome poverty and disease. These messages often exploit desperate people who lack access to basic healthcare and economic opportunities, encouraging them to donate money they can't afford to lose in pursuit of miraculous prosperity that rarely materializes. The theological problems with prosperity theology are obvious to anyone familiar with traditional Christian teachings. Jesus explicitly warned about the spiritual dangers of wealth, praised the poor as blessed, and demanded that his followers sell their possessions and give to the needy. The New Testament is filled with condemnations of greed and warnings about the incompatibility between serving God and serving money. But prosperity theology has proven remarkably resilient because it meets deep psychological needs in modern capitalist societies. It allows people to pursue material success without guilt, provides religious justification for economic inequality, and promises that spiritual practice can solve practical problems that might otherwise require political action. The success of prosperity theology also reflects the broader triumph of therapeutic culture in American society. Instead of demanding moral transformation or social responsibility, prosperity Christianity offers personal fulfillment and individual empowerment. It transforms religion from a call to service into a tool for self-improvement. This therapeutic approach has influenced even churches that explicitly reject prosperity theology. Mainstream Protestant denominations increasingly emphasize how faith can improve mental health, enhance relationships, and provide meaning and purpose rather than challenging people to sacrificial discipleship or prophetic witness. The COVID-19 pandemic provided a telling test of prosperity theology's claims. When prosperity preachers like Kenneth Copeland and Benny Hinn failed to prevent the spread of disease through spiritual means, their followers faced cognitive dissonance between theological promises and empirical reality. Some questioned their faith, but many others found ways to rationalize the apparent failure of spiritual techniques to control material circumstances. The economic consequences of capitalism's influence on American religion extend beyond individual churches to the broader religious landscape. Religious institutions increasingly compete for resources using market strategies that favor entertainment value over spiritual depth, consumer satisfaction over moral challenge, and numerical growth over qualitative transformation. This market-driven approach has contributed to the polarization of American religion between high-end spiritual products for affluent consumers and mass-market offerings that appeal to broad audiences. Traditional religious institutions that emphasized community service, social justice, and spiritual discipline have struggled to compete with churches that offer more immediately appealing messages about personal prosperity and individual fulfillment. The long-term consequences of American religion's addiction to capitalism remain unclear, but early indicators suggest troubling trends. Younger Americans are increasingly skeptical of religious institutions they perceive as primarily concerned with money and political power rather than spiritual growth and social transformation. Survey data consistently shows that Americans who identify as religious are increasingly likely to be older, whiter, and more conservative than the general population. This demographic shift reflects the success of prosperity theology in appealing to affluent Americans while alienating younger and more diverse communities that are less invested in capitalist ideology. The global reputation of American Christianity has been damaged by its association with commercial prosperity preaching and political partisanship. International observers often view American evangelicalism as a form of cultural imperialism that exports capitalist values disguised as spiritual truth. Perhaps most significantly, the merger of Christianity and capitalism has undermined religion's traditional role as a source of moral criticism and social transformation. Instead of challenging unjust economic systems, many American churches have become cheerleaders for the very forces that create poverty, inequality, and environmental destruction. The prophetic tradition that once made Christianity a force for social justice, from the abolition of slavery to the civil rights movement, has been largely replaced by therapeutic messages that encourage individual adaptation to existing systems rather than collective action to transform them. Some American Christians have recognized these problems and are working to recover more authentic forms of faith that emphasize social justice, environmental responsibility, and economic equality. Progressive Christian movements, liberation theology, and creation spirituality represent attempts to reconnect Christianity with its historical concerns about poverty and inequality. But these alternative voices remain marginalized within American religious culture, overwhelmed by the massive resources and sophisticated marketing of prosperity-oriented ministries. The prosperity gospel's success in capturing American Christianity appears almost complete, despite its obvious contradictions with traditional Christian teachings. The story of how American religion became addicted to capitalism illustrates the power of economic systems to reshape cultural institutions in their own image. Just as capitalism transformed American politics, education, and media, it has successfully transformed American religion into another market-driven enterprise focused on consumer satisfaction rather than spiritual transformation. Understanding this history helps explain why American Christianity often seems more concerned with defending free market economics than following Jesus' teachings about caring for the poor and challenging unjust systems. It reveals how theological language has been co-opted to serve economic interest, and how spiritual practices have been commercialized to generate profit. Most importantly, it demonstrates that the current state of American religion isn't inevitable or eternal. The prosperity gospel is a relatively recent development that represents a dramatic departure from traditional Christian teachings. Recognizing its historical origins opens possibilities for recovering more authentic forms of faith that prioritize spiritual growth over material success and social transformation over individual prosperity. As we conclude this exploration of one of the most significant religious transformations in American history, I want to thank you for joining me at Professor Archive. The story of how American Christianity became addicted to capitalism reveals profound truths about the relationship between economic and cultural systems, the power of ideology to reshape religious traditions, and the ongoing struggle between spiritual and material values in modern society. This history helps explain many puzzling aspects of contemporary American religion. Why so many Christians support economic policies that seem to contradict Jesus' teachings about caring for the poor, why religious institutions often operate more like businesses than spiritual communities, and why American Christianity has become associated with prosperity rather than sacrifice. Understanding how this transformation occurred doesn't resolve the theological and ethical questions it raises, but it does help us recognize that current arrangements aren't divinely ordained or historically inevitable. The merger of Christianity and capitalism was accomplished through human choices that can be recognized, criticized, and potentially reversed. The questions raised by this history remain urgently relevant. Can religious traditions maintain their prophetic voice while operating within capitalist systems? How should spiritual communities balance material needs with spiritual priorities? What role should religion play in addressing economic inequality and social injustice? What's your perspective on this remarkable transformation? Have you observed the influence of commercial values on religious institutions in your own community or country? How do you think spiritual communities should navigate the relationship between faith and money in modern capitalist societies? I'm genuinely interested in your thoughts on these complex questions, so please share them in the comments below. And don't forget to tell me what time you're watching this and which city you're tuning in from. These questions about religion, economics, and spiritual authenticity resonate across cultures and economic systems worldwide. If this deep dive into the intersection of faith and economics fascinated you, make sure you're subscribed to Professor Archive and have that notification bell activated. We explore the hidden forces that shape our world, from the grand narratives of economic development to the intimate details of how market forces transform cultural institutions. Every week, we uncover stories that help us understand not just where we've been, but how economic and spiritual systems continue to influence each other in profound and often unexpected ways. The next time you hear a prosperity preacher promising wealth through faith, or see a megachurch operating like a shopping mall, you'll understand that you're witnessing not eternal religious truth, but historical innovation, the culmination of a centuries-long process that transformed Christianity from a religion of the poor into an ideology of the prosperous. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep seeking to understand how the pursuit of profit continues to reshape the pursuit of the sacred in ways that would amaze and probably horrify the founders of the world's great spiritual traditions. This is Professor Archive, reminding you that the most important stories are often the ones that reveal how economic forces transform cultural and spiritual life in ways their participants never fully intended or understood.